Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here. Talk about the new film in the God's Not Dead series, God's Not Dead, In God We Trust. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So unless you have been blissfully living under a rock, you probably know that an American presidential election is looming on the very near horizon. And for better or worse, and let's be honest, it's definitely worse, it just seems that politics have infiltrated all aspects of life, leaving many Christians just to wonder how best to navigate this new reality. And in the film God's Not Dead, In God We Trust, director David A.R. White offers one solution to that problem, and that is for Christians to become more politically active. The God's Not Dead kind of series of films, they've always been probably the most socially conscious of the faith-based film genre. And an opening montage in this movie, which has visuals of COVID lockdowns and vaccines and riots, very quickly establishes that once again, this film will confront very contemporary issues. Unfortunately, it's just not able to craft a very good film along the way, because this isn't good for many reasons, which we'll get into in just a second. But this is a very kind of heavy-handed political speech delivered through the vehicle of an uninspiring faith-based movie. I think this is a movie that's really unlikely to please and satisfy anyone beyond those just desiring kind of the cheap pleasure of having their political ideologies or religious beliefs affirmed. And in my recent movie review of the faith-based film The Forge, I detailed kind of why I think faith-based films should not be immune to criticism regardless of how agreeable that message is, and why I think faith-based sort of message-driven films are often best approached as sort of two distinct entities, the message and then the film. So I won't retread that whole discussion here, only to say that the same rules definitely apply. Only, I think, unlike The Forge, which I do think was a well-meaning but just poorly executed film, In God We Trust is plagued with issues both as far as the film and the message. Because narratively, In God We Trust is just derailed by, I think, some of the worst writing in any movie that I have seen released this year, faith-based or otherwise, because almost every character across the board in this film is just entirely one note. And kind of what has become a recurrent issue with the entire God's Not Dead series is that the writing seems more interested in giving Christian characters these big heroic victories than it is in making those victories feel earned or believable. Because the antagonists, the bad guys in this, are almost cartoonishly evil, just completely, utterly irredeemable without any kind of characterization beyond their own just sort of sinfulness and repugnance. I think if they had started twirling mustaches and releasing maniacal laughs, it wouldn't have felt out of place. And those very dehumanizing portrayals of angry, God-hating atheists is this starkly contrasted with a flawless hero whose really only struggle in this seems to be dealing with just how bad and sinful everyone else is around him. I think this film desires to kind of equip and encourage Christians to navigate the very divisive, complicated political climate of the real world, but it just struggles to offer much insight through a story that just seems so detached from reality. I think instead of good faith, nuanced discussion, this film presents a series of straw man arguments, treating very light touches on the cheek as just total knockout blows. And that's perhaps most evident in the kind of climactic third act political debate, where rather than respond to the very difficult and I think valid questions posed by his opponent, the protagonist merely starts just preaching the gospel to the very sun and thunderous applause of the entire audience, to the point that his political adversary simply gets up and walks off stage, accepting defeat. And in many ways, it just seems like the equivalent of almost like a Christian wish fulfillment fantasy. Because while it may make some Christian viewers feel good to see very bumbling atheists or, politicians that sit across the political aisle completely tongue-tied by very simple Christian religious rhetoric, I think such cheap escapism arguably does more to heap more coals on the fire of our very emotionally charged political climate rather than offer a better alternative. And if movies like The Forge by the Kendrick brothers was more like a sermon than a film, then In God We Trust feels more like a political rally rather than it does like a cinematic experience, because really every element in this film is in service to promoting the film's very singular message. And apart from actress Samari Armstrong, who is in a relatively more nuanced role as sort of David Hill, which is the pastor turned politician, as his campaign manager, really all the acting in this feels just completely flat and uninspired. Kind of similarly, the cinematography is completely uninventive, almost to the point of being amateurish, and I just can't recall a single moment of any kind of humor or levity to soften the delivery of that very sort of self-serious message. And the very disproportionate emphasis on the message over the film as a film, I think would be more palpable if the message itself was more inspiring. And I'll get into the this a little more in the beneath the surface section in just a moment. But really, the line between like conservative politics and Christianity in this is difficult to distinguish at times. With Pastor David Hill dedicating almost as much time like decrying the evils of things like socialism as he does declaring the goodness of Christ. And there's even just a theme in this that I think is troubling, that suggests that sort of true change in America cannot come through just sort of the local church and believers, but only through politics. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, probably the best thing I can say about this film is that there's not any content to be concerned about. As far as language, the only thing that maybe comes to mind is that one character says the word heck, but nothing beyond that. And there's no violence and there's no sexuality. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface of this, the main one is, as I already mentioned to, just sort of the contrast between the influence of the church and the influence of politics. Because when attempting to recruit Pastor David Hill into running for political office, his campaign manager named Lottie remarks, "It's public service, same as you're doing now, so there's nothing you can do as a pastor that can't be undone by a politician. If you want to make a real difference, this is how it's done." And to be fair, it's not entirely clear whether the audience is supposed to agree with or endorse that sentiment or not, as Lottie, the character herself, comes to distance herself later in the film from her initial hard-nosed political approach. But I think even if viewers are intended to reject that sentiment, that quote, the story itself largely unfolds in a way that validates it. Because despite his good intentions as a local pastor, David's ministry is just repeatedly handicapped by political policy. The Center for Women that he runs is unable to help those most in need due to a lack of funding or just disagreeable political loopholes, ultimately inspiring him to step aside from the church in order to enter politics. And really the only time in this film that Pastor David is shown acting in his sort of more pastoral capacity is merely to showcase his complete ineffectiveness to do so because of political influence. And during a later political debate, David rejects the label of being a Christian nationalist, saying, "Whenever anyone of faith promotes a policy that you don't like, you label them a Christian nationalist." And I am prone to agree with that. I'm not sure that this film necessarily endorses Christian nationalism, but it does operate under some of the same, I think, troubling assumptions that power in politics is a more tenable solution to the spiritual decay in America than is sort of service in the church. Because if America is no longer a God-fearing nation, then the solution proposed through this film is for Christians to become more politically active, gain power and influence, and then legislate Christian morality. All that being said, I do think there are occasional, at least glimpses, of the more inspiring message that this film may have wanted to convey. Because when the Christian band Newsboys, who again makes another appearance in this series, encounters David at a venue, they ask if David is there for ministry, and when he explains that he is actually there for political reasons, they respond, "Oh, your new ministry." And I think that message of sort of glorifying God through our vocation outside of the church and seeing all arenas of culture as our mission field is a good one that Christians can very readily affirm. I think in this film, the trouble only really emerges when sort of those other mission fields, particularly the local church, seem to be pushed down in order to elevate just the importance of political influence as some sort of silver bullet solution. And one other theme that I do think this film does a better job of conveying is just that you can't fight darkness with more darkness. You have to confront it with light. Because while some of the details of the narrative are, I think, unrealistic and unconventional, I do think Pastor David's commitment to demonstrating his Christian faith, not just through his proposed policies, but also through his character and conduct, is very admirable. Because kind of all throughout this film, he's pushed to adopt sort of the negative campaign tactics of his opponents, to just tear down his opponents and kind of dig up dirt skeletons in the closet. And kind of in response to that, he muses, "I know it's useless to fight dark with darkness," and instead he says, we have to push the good of our faith into the political process. And it just brought to mind for me the scripture 1 Peter 3:15, 16, which says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks for the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience." I think Christians should stand firm for truth, but the way they do so should also reflect a very Christ-like demeanor. So in the end, in a year that has seen the release of many, I think, excellent faith-based films like Sound of Hope or Unsung Hero or Cabrini, God's Not Dead, In God We Trust just feels like a step backwards. I think almost ironically, despite the characters criticizing and being reluctant to run a negative campaign where, the path to political victory is just to, not to prop themselves up, but merely pull their opponents down, The film itself seems to almost adopt that strategy. The movie may offer some kind of shallow therapeutic pleasure of watching heroic Christians steamroll their evil, unbelieving opponents while boldly affirming conservative politics, but I think just the overall lack of nuance and just the tendency to dehumanize anyone that differs ideologically won't be of much profit to anyone in the real world this coming election season. I think God is not dead, but perhaps it's time for the God's Not Dead movie franchise to finally be put to rest. But hey, we'd love to hear what you thought. If you had some other kind of negative opinions of this as I had, or hey, maybe you enjoyed this more than I did, be respectful, but jump into the comments section and let's have a conversation about that. If you haven't done so too, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider, and lots of movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast and interviews and just a bunch of other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching, stay safe, and continue to collide with the world for Christ.